Hello, this is Professor Henderson, and this is a week 2 lecture on classical China. If you remember back to the first week of this class, we talked about river valley civilizations. These were the first civilizations that were able to form in the valleys of rivers, and you read specifically about Egypt on the Nile and Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Well, there was another one in what is East Asia or China today along the Yellow River, the Honghe River. And this was called the Shang Dynasty, dynasty being a family where rule passes down. This is the first dynasty in Chinese history that can be verified by archaeology. There is written evidence or legendary evidence of previous civilizations in China, but this is the first one that's actually verified by archaeologists. Now, the Shang Dynasty does make a contribution to Chinese history. This river valley civilization practiced the veneration or the worship of one's ancestors. This means that they, with the great respect that they had for elders, they thought that when one of these elders dies, their spirit lives on, and they're able to ask these spirits, these nameless, faceless spirits to them, who have long lived before them, for advice about practical matters. And they did this through a process called oracle bones. An oracle bone was a large bone of an animal, such as the pelvic bone of a cow or the shell of a large turtle, and they would go to a special shaman who could read these, and they would write their request, or they would make a request to the ancestors. For example, who should my daughter marry? They would write the names of the options, the men who were the suitors, on the oracle bone. The shaman would press onto the dried bone a red-hot iron rod that would send cracks throughout the bone, and the shaman claimed that he could read these cracks and tell exactly what the dead ancestors were communicating. It had to be interpreted by one of these shamans, and then you would get your answer. You see here this idea of the elderly, being extremely important to the Chinese. These people had, on life, lived many, many years and had experience, and even after death, they continued to grow in wisdom. And their wisdom was sought by the Chinese through the use of oracle bones. Now, as you'll see later, this laid a great foundation for the ideology known as Confucianism, which we'll get to in a moment, and you also read about in your textbook readings for the week. Now, another important idea that came out of this early river valley civilization is called the Mandate of Heaven. The Shang Dynasty, over generations, began to grow corrupt. They no longer really cared about the peasants. The government leaders began to only worry about their own comfort and their own wealth, as happens to many governments. And one regional aristocratic family within the dynasty claimed that the Shang family had lost their legitimacy to rule, and they challenged them. This was the Zhou dynasty, and you see it in your notes and in your reading. It's spelled Z-H-O-U. It's pronounced Zhou. And this Zhou family challenged the Shang. They claimed that the mandate of heaven was no longer upon the Shang. Now, what do they mean by mandate of heaven? The mandate of heaven is a concept that means there is this cosmic order. It's not really a personal God, but rather a cosmic order in the universe that gives the right to rule to just and generous leaders. And the Zhou argued that the Shang dynasty, involved in their own comfort, had forgotten the peasants, and they had forfeited this right, this legitimacy to the rule. So the Zhou said, well, we could be better rulers than the Shang, and they challenged them, and this challenge was a civil war. It was an attempt to overthrow the Shang. And they did. The Zhou dynasty overthrew the Shang, and because they treated the peasants better, the people of China accepted their legitimacy. Now, this is a cycle that will go on throughout Chinese history. A very important ideology began here. The mandate of heaven justifies a revolt against the ruling dynasty if it's successful. If it's not successful, then the people say, well, the challenger did not really have the mandate of heaven. There's kind of a fatalistic determinism about this, where if it wins, then it's justified. So the mandate of heaven does allow for a revolt against Chinese leaders, but it is justified only if it wins. Now, this is quite different than the Egyptians, as you read about. The Pharaoh is a god himself. Any revolt is illegitimate. Where in China, there is a way to challenge the authority of the government, and this ideology is called the mandate of heaven. So the Zhou conquered the Shang and set up rule for a while. Now, the Zhou dynasty fell apart, and it issued in a period in Chinese history known as the era or the period of the Warring States, and it's just like it sounds. The different provinces of the Zhou dynasty went to war against each other because several aristocratic families claimed to have the mandate of heaven, and nobody won. And it left China fragmented into these regions that were in a perpetual state of war. Now, what happens every time a great civilization is humiliated and declines is they begin to ask themselves, okay, what did we do? What is the cause of this failure of our civilization? And they turn inward and begin this great period of introspection. And the fruitful thing about the period of the Warring States is three very important, enduring ideologies that will impact all of China's history began during this time period. These are three different ideas about what does it take for civilization to stay strong, and what caused our downfall. And in each of these three ideologies, which are in the notes, and you'll read about them in the text reading for the week, there is an answer to what we did that was wrong. And within that answer, there is an implication about the nature of humanity. What are human beings like? And what is the best way to rule a civilization? These three ideologies, legalism, Confucianism, and Taoism, give very different answers to this question, and all remain and play important roles in the history of China. Now, the period of the Warring States ended when the Qin dynasty came along. That's spelled Qin or sometimes CH''IN. And the Qin dynasty used the harsh system called legalism to unite China together. It's a very authoritative, almost dictatorship type of ideology. So the Qin united China, and in that way legalism proved to be quite useful. And the Qin dynasty only lasted 14 years in China's history, but accomplished many, many great things. During the 14 years of the Qin dynasty, because they demanded absolute authority from the Chinese, they built the first version of the Great Wall of China that you all have heard about. This was to keep out nomadic invaders in the northwestern frontier. So they built the first Great Wall. Moreover, they established a Chinese bureaucracy, a system of government that has a chain of command from the emperor all the way down, and it allows one emperor to govern a large unified area. So they created a bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy was ruled through legalism, which is basically fear of breaking these rules. Moreover, the Qin dynasty built an infrastructure of roads, of a communication network. They built bridges. They basically interconnected all of China. And this was not only to facilitate trade, but it was also to project their power into formerly secluded areas so they could tax all areas of the Chinese empire. So they built this infrastructure. Also, they created a standardized set of weights and measurements. Try to imagine an area unified where not only does one area, let's say, use feet, yards, and miles, and the other part of the area uses the metric system, but imagine many different systems. It's just the result of the randomness of historical creations. The Qin dynasty created standardized weights and measurements, so merchants could communicate with merchants. You knew what you were getting. You didn't have to do these numerical translations in your mind, and that facilitated a great unification of China. China has this idea in its history, this powerful idea of unity, and this begins with the Qin. The good part about the Qin is they accomplished so much that would benefit dynasties that came after them. The downside is that they were so harsh that it was inevitable that people did not want them to rule, and they were overthrown after only 14 years. If you've ever heard of the terracotta warriors that were discovered buried under the ground in this enormous tomb in the 1970s, this is the tomb of the emperor of the Qin dynasty, who used so many resources of the people to build this enormous underground tomb with thousands of life-size warriors made out of terracotta clay, each an individual carving, warriors he thought he was taking to his grave. The most important dynasty of the Chinese classical age, however, is the Han Dynasty, H-A-N. It was during the Han Dynasty that Confucianism, one of these three ideologies, really comes to the forefront. The leader of the Han Dynasty, borrowing the concept of a bureaucracy, and I posted a picture on the assignment page of what a bureaucracy is, a very simplified version. It's the Han Dynasty who really creates a synthesis between the Chinese bureaucracy and Confucianism. A bureaucracy is one person at the top with a second tier of administrators, and they're in charge of different regions, and then the regions are split up into smaller regions, and it's kind of a pyramid-shaped system of command. And this is so one person, the emperor, can give an order and it can be passed down, and it centralizes order under a single authority. Oftentimes corporations and CEOs or schools even are set up in these hierarchical bureaucratic orders. But if you think really carefully about what you've read about the nature of Confucianism, what is Confucianism? It's this idea, and I won't go into detail because you'll get this in your textbook reading, but Confucianism places this inordinate emphasis on human relationships. It presupposes that all societies are built around unequal relationships between people. There's somebody in your life who's in charge over you, for example, a boss at work. And Confucian believed that families are patriarchal. The husband is the head of the household. And there's someone in authority over you, but you are more than likely in charge of somebody else. There's people below you. What works in Confucianism is when the leadership takes the responsibility to model moral behavior for those beneath them. And only then will you get the respect and the obedience of people below. This is why Confucius never became a politician. His teachings placed them at the fault of Chinese troubles during the period of the Warring States. Why was China having trouble? Because the politicians did not model moral behavior, and they did not induce the people beneath them to try to obey. So if you think about what a bureaucracy is, this chain of command, well, almost everybody has someone over them and someone beneath them in terms of authority. Confucianism blended with that extremely well, and it made for a very efficient bureaucracy. And so this political structure was actually enhanced by the belief of Confucianism. And you know that in order to get a job in the Chinese government, you had to spend years studying Confucian thought. Then you had to take a big test, and that test determined whether you would get a job in the bureaucracy. So, these people who had spent their whole life studying Confucianism could take a test and suddenly have this job as a civil servant in the Chinese government. In other words, they could go from a meager peasant family, in theory, to being very esteemed and very powerful and wealthy. A peasant son who's bright could take this test, pass it, get a job in the bureaucracy, and the next time his friends and family see him, they would have to bow down to him in his presence. So there is the possibility of mobility in China. A person can go from the bottom and climb up through his own merit. And note that that's quite different than what you have in India during this same time. So, to study Confucianism your whole life is going to give you a respect for the teachings of Confucius. When you make it into the bureaucracy, you're probably going to model good behavior and obey those above you who model good behavior for you. So here you have an ideology of government, Confucianism, that blends very well with the nature of the bureaucracy that was established by the Qin and then later on implemented by the Han. The Qin dynasty, by the way, is where the name China comes from. The Han dynasty, the people who make up China today, the largest ethnicity in China, are called the Han. So you can see the legacy of these two dynasties in their names. Now, in your reading about Chinese society, you'll see that most Chinese were peasants, and they worked rather hard lives. You also see that landed farmers began to pool their farms together and create, I guess you might call them corporate farms, at the expense of the small landowning farmers. And this was thought to break the back of the normal Chinese everyday farmer. This led to peasants during hard times, or farmers during hard times, having to sell their land. And who was there to buy it up? These wealthy aristocrats who grew even wealthier in their land holdings. The Chinese reformer who came along to stop this was called Wang Mang, and he again is in your reading. Note his solution to this problem. Wang Mang thought that a direct government intervention in terms of redistributing land would solve this problem and create it would end this process where the wealthy became even wealthier, and the middle class farmers were dropping down into the peasant class. In other words, everything in the middle was going away, and a smaller and smaller percentage of Chinese aristocrats were owning a greater and greater amount of its wealth. Basically, this is an early form of socialism. Redistributing land, putting a cap on the amount of land that somebody could own, and if you had excess of that cap, it was given to these previous farmers who had been driven out of business by drought. This idea, of course, was not acceptable to the wealthy, and Wang Mang was executed by them. Peasant unrest is a very important social problem throughout China's history. Even today, there are several thousand peasant revolts in China every day, as there is still a great deal of inequality in China. But what's interesting is that if you look at China's history, the main ideology of China, Confucianism, has created a legacy of inequality. It justifies, it takes for granted that people are unequal in their class and in their gender. On a final note, there's one last legacy of Confucianism on China today, and it's this idea that your entire future depends on this test that you take. You take a Confucian test. By the way, the test lasted 3 days. You were locked in a small room where you had nothing but something to write with and a surface to write on. You were giving an essay question, and you were given 3 days to write. And imagine a peasant son who spent all his life, all his youth, studying for this one test, who went in and failed. His parents had sacrificed, hoping to raise the status of their family up the Chinese bureaucracy, and he had let them down. Needless to say, there was a tremendously high suicide rate among students who failed this test. So that's the downside of the mobility that existed in China. A poor family could move up, but the intense pressure on a student taking one test to improve his family was often enormous. For this reason, taking tests and performance on tests is a very high priority among Chinese today. Education is a very high priority. People in East Asia will sacrifice most anything to give their children a good education and a shot of improving their lives through this. So this educational value is a legacy of the Confucian tradition. Thank you very much.